What's up? It's Rowan here from Art of Smart Education with the weekly HSC Economics stats update. In this episode, we're looking at all things Trump tariffs, but actually with some data now about the impact that these tariffs are going to have on the Australian economy. So some really good numbers here that you're going to be able to use when you're looking at the impact of global protection on the Australian economy. In particular, these tariffs in your essays and some of your 3 to 5 marker short answer questions. So let's dive right in. Now, if it's your first time dialing in these episodes, I unpack the key stats and headlines around the domestic and global economy, giving you the stats and analysis you need to unlock that Band 6 in the HSC Economics course. So, unless you've been sleeping under a rock, you're going to be very aware that the US and Trump in particular have implemented whole-scale tariffs, right? Pretty much across every single trading partner the US trades with, including Australia, even though we have a free trade agreement with the US. Now, ultimately, right, what is the impact that those tariffs are now expected to have on the Australian economy? Now, the IMF has produced some, growth updates in terms of they, make predictions around global growth and particular country growth, and they've updated those. And so we can see ultimately, okay, that they're expecting that there'll be $13 billion impact. So our annual output, our GDP, will be $13 billion lower in 2025 than predicted in January, okay? So in other words, they were expecting a 2.1% economic growth for the year, and they've now downgraded it to 1.6%. So that's a 0.5% drop in economic growth. Now, note, the March budget forecast that the Australian, Labor government have forecast, coming into this election, obviously they need to win for this to become the budget. But they used a forecast of 2.25%. Now, note that 2.25 was already rosier than what the IMF had, in January, right? Pre-tariffs being implemented. And you can see now that it's still well above 2.25 versus 1.6. There's a bit of a gap there. And so this is, I think, a valid criticism that you can have when you're analysing fiscal policy, and this is on both sides, whether or not it's the government or an opposition. What are the underlying assumptions they are relying upon for their overall budget outcome? And so in this case, the government is relying on stronger economic growth than the IMF was predicting pre-tariffs and certainly post-tariffs, right? To say that that's what's going to produce its current budget deficit, right? Now, the reality is if economic growth is weaker, what this means is that, revenue will not be to the same extent, okay? The automatic stabilizers will kick in, there'll be less tax revenue, and there probably may be more unemployment, right? And so there might be more welfare payments on the expenditure side, and so you can see the deficit blow out even more. So, what we've got here in terms of impact, therefore, of the tariffs is number one, $13 billion impact, right? Economic growth to go from 2.1 to 1.6. But we've also got, if we dig in here a little bit, okay, some of that analysis that we can see just around, budgets, right, and budget deficits, and the fact that this will likely also cause, regardless, really, Labor or Liberal, whoever gets elected, right, both to some extent are going to be relying on forecasts that probably will prove to be optimistic. It's going to result in budget deficits that are going to blow out and be larger than anticipated as we see this sort of impact come through, okay? And so you can see here, these are, this was the budget impact, this was the RBA, this is the IMF, the latest, right? And so you can sort of see, and these are for the following year, so you can sort of see notably as well here that the RBA was slightly more conservative, in their growth forecast, in February, than the government as well. And so it's not just the IMF, you've also got the RBA saying, that 2.25 looks pretty rosy. Now, of course, as you go into 2026, you can sort of see that, that's far enough out into the future that hopefully, the growth forecasts that the government is relying upon for their budget look pretty similar, right? As we can see, there's less of a discrepancy here, okay? So that's the first thing that we can really take out from this. Now, what else can we take out? So ABC also have some coverage on this, okay? And, what they've also identified is, that this is going to not just have an impact on Australia, it's also going to have an impact on the global economy, right? And so we can see here that the IMF has basically, slashed its growth forecast for 2025 from 3.3 to 2.8. So again, about 0.5%. So interestingly, the slash they've done to Australia, 0.5%, is what they're also expecting the global economy to have at 0.5%, okay? And so we can sort of see that, they're expecting a pretty similar impact for Australia. Now, note, we only have a 10% baseline tariff, right? So, this is impacts for us. And, where I think, relative to some other countries, got very minimal tariffs. And so, I think for other countries, the impact's going to be obviously a lot greater. Now, they've also cut growth targets for China, most European, economies, and the UK and Japan are going to be the hardest hit. Okay, so the Japanese economy is only expected to grow 0.6% in 2025, and the UK 1.1%. Now, I think the final thing here to sort of highlight, right, and you can see that all of the Guardian, ABC, SMH all have commentary on this, but obviously they're highlighting slightly different things, okay, as well, right, in terms of focus. Now, this one he's also got some stuff around just, okay, how might this play out in terms of the impact for Australia and inflation? And so what's interesting is, despite the hit, Australia is expected to remain one of the fastest growing major economies in the developed world. So we're sort of looking at this going, okay, 1.6%, like, oh, poor us, right? But the reality is we're going to be one of the fastest growing major economies, right? Which is great. It also highlights some sort of obviously bigger problems globally with the fact that growth is so anemic, it's so poor globally, that at 1.6%, Australia can be one of the fastest growing major economies in the developed world. It's sort of scary, right? But I think it just highlights, okay, while things may not look that great, $13 billion impact, 0.5%, kick on GDP impact, we're still relatively, compared to the rest of the globe, in a strong position. Now, note, the IMF graded the US down by 0.9%, so you can see that 0.5% for Australia, almost an entire percent downgraded growth through the US, okay? IMF is expecting, for China, right, that it's still going to have a 1.3% hit to growth, okay? But that's going to be offset by a lot of spending by Chinese authorities, right? So the overall reduction in growth will be 0.6%, okay? So it'll be less than the US. In other words, US tariffs are going to hurt US economic growth more than it'll hurt Chinese economic growth, which I think is obviously interesting, given that the purpose of these tariffs are designed to address the trade deficit that the US has with China. Now, ultimately, okay, I think the key things that you should really take from this, okay, across all of this is that you've got some really great data. You want to be able to use this in essays, certainly any essays that are looking at, one, impacts of global protection and free trade on the Australian economy, impacts of global changes on trade and financial flows, right? These are things that you can certainly reference and use. And then finally, the other area that you could utilize this for is if you're evaluating fiscal policy and analyzing fiscal policy, because one of the things that you can look at is, as part of analysis of fiscal policy, is, the underlying assumptions that they rely upon and whether or not those are very optimistic, and then therefore whether or not the budget outcomes are going to look very different. So hopefully that helps in giving you actually some really practical, because there's so much like noise happening with the Trump tariffs, that I think what's really great about this data is that you've now got some really concrete examples that you can use in the HSC Economics course. If you have any questions, drop it in the comments below. Otherwise, I will see you next week with another weekly HSC Economics Stats update.